Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Some say the Nazis' legendary strategy was a myth, others that it was a brilliant new way to wage war. Whatever the truth, the concept of striking quickly and setting their enemies off balance was key to how the German military approached warfare in the early 20th century. In the early stages of their quest for territory, the dive bomber played a key role in this strategy. But as the engines that powered their enemies' fighters got faster, and as the British fought back with ferocious tenacity, the dive bomber was nearing obsolescence. Something new would have to be found, a better way for the Luftwaffe to strike into enemy territory. They would need a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber. The 1937 Zurich Air Meeting. Pilots and aircraft from all over Europe arrive in the Swiss capital for 10 days of races, aerobatics and demonstrations. The Italians and the French both bring pilots and aircraft. The British send a small aerial team, and Germany has entries in many events. In an alpine circuit race that runs from Dubendorf to Thun to Bellinzona and back to Dubendorf, a Messerschmitt 109 wins the first round of the race. In the second section, a Dornier Do-17, a new German bomber, leads the way, completing the circuit in 58 minutes and 42 seconds at a speed of 233.5 miles per hour to win the race. Though the race is a minor event in comparison to the speed races and aerobatic displays taking place over the weekend, it is vindication for some members of Germany's fledgling air force. On board the plane during the race is General Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Reich Air Ministry, a man who has played a key role in the aircraft's creation. It is an aircraft that has long been in the works. Its original concept began in 1932, when it was designed to be a freight aircraft for the State Railway or a fast mail plane for Lufthansa. But when the Nazis come to power, Hermann Göring plucks Erhard Milch from running Lufthansa and brings him into the Air Ministry. Milch gives the go-ahead for Dornier to build prototypes of the aircraft, and it is designated the Do-17. The resulting aircraft is less than Lufthansa hopes. Its cabin is cramped and it costs too much to use as a mail plane. Abandoned in a Dornier warehouse, it sits neglected until a Lufthansa flight captain asks to take it out for a ride. He takes the aircraft for a flight and discovers that not only is it very fast, but it's also a very nimble machine. With some work, it could become a fast bomber. Around this time, the Air Ministry set their sights firmly on their needs for the future, and they look for an aircraft that can be secretly converted into a bomber. They put out a call for a freight aircraft with special equipment. Some adjustments to the Do-17, mainly giving it a twin-tail stabilizer, may give them exactly what they need. The Swiss air race gives Milch a first-hand view of exactly how fast this aircraft is, and proof that it can compete with and even outrace modern fighter planes. Germany has found its Schnellbomber. The idea behind a Schnellbomber is simple. Create a medium bomber that can strike its targets quickly. Because of its fast speed, the Schnellbomber will not need any defensive armament. Its best defense will be to slip away before any pursuing enemy fighters have a chance to catch up to it.
To be called a Schnellbomber, in my opinion, is an aeroplane that could get in, drop its load accurately, and get out unscathed. That is a Schnellbomber. Low level. That's the key word.
From its arrival into the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, the Do-17 proves a capable aircraft. Then again in 1939, as Germany attacks Poland, it continues to prove reliable, serving as the backbone of the Luftwaffe's bomber force.
Well, the Do-17, the nickname was the Flying Pencil. A beautiful plane, yeah, was also the first one which I flew. That was during early 1940 in the multi-engine school at the Baltic Sea in Kolberg. Very nice, very smooth plane, still also with inline engines. They changed it later on to radial. And I think it was very successful in the Poland and French campaign. I flew over Berlin quite a bit with the Do-17s, and later on they improved it tremendously to the Dornier 217s, which was a radial. And Dornier 217s was used as a night bomber over England, I think, well into 1943-44. Both very nice planes, easy to fly, and specifically low altitude or no altitude at all, over the ground, exciting. Under the bridge and in height of tower, exciting plane, yes.
As the war progresses, however, the Do-17's fate begins to unravel. Its advantage of speed is diminishing with each passing day as British engines improve. By the Battle of Britain, Do-17s are being regularly shot down. In mid-1940, production ceases on the Do-17. It is to be replaced by two planes, a heavy bomber based on it, the Dornier Do-217, and an aircraft from Junkers, the Ju-88.
The early part, up to the mid-1944, the only Schnell bomber the Germans really had would have been the Junkers 88. Although they had Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s that could carry bombs, they were hardly Schnell bombers. They were more ground attack, used for ground attack. But as a bomber, the Junkers 88 was really the only one that could actually be nominated as that.
On its first flight in 1936, the Ju-88 races to a speed of 360 miles per hour, a full 100 miles an hour faster than the Do-17. Surely this will be the Luftwaffe's new Schnellbomber, one that will help them regain the advantage that has been lost in recent months against Allied fighters. At least it may have, if not for General Ernst Udet. The flying ace of the Great War is now in charge of the development wing of the Reich Air Ministry, thanks to his friendship with Hermann Göring. Udet's love of dive bombing leads to a major change in the Ju-88. Demanding that this aircraft become a dive bomber like the Stuka, it requires 2 years of re-engineering before the aircraft is ready to fly again in 1938. So enthusiastic are Udet, Göring and others about this new plane, they declare that it will be the standard bomber for the Luftwaffe, with factories all over the country set to churn out 250 units a month. Milch is less enthusiastic, but his worries fall on deaf ears, as the Junkers engineers impress Göring with tales of the bomber's amazing abilities. Now fitted with heavy air brakes and the increased weight giving it structural problems, the Ju-88 is ready to lumber into the skies. By the invasion of Poland, only 12 Ju-88s are available, and production continues to be slow while problems are ironed out. It is capable of diving on a target and dropping its bomb load with pinpoint accuracy, but at a price. The stress of pulling that much weight out of a dive takes a toll on the bomber's airframe. By 1943, tactics had changed to accommodate this, with the Ju-88 attacking at a 45-degree angle before releasing 4,400 pounds of bombs on its targets.
The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. Of the three great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Focke-Wulf 190, the Ju-88 and the Me-262 were the three. And the Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190A4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Heinkel 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up at the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication, which was not, and also there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They had learned to put the four crew of the Ju-88 into one glass house, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188, and I was very impressed with both types of aircraft.
The shortcomings of the Ju-88 are becoming apparent, and while it maintains its place as one of the Luftwaffe's most reliable and versatile aircraft, something new is needed. The solution may be found in Bomber B, a call by the Air Ministry for a new medium bomber, one that will replace all medium bombers in the Luftwaffe. It isn't long before a Junkers design for that specification leads the pack, the Ju-288. This highly redesigned version of the 88 will have a new pressurized cockpit, the ability to fly at much higher altitudes, better speed in the form of two Yubot 222 engines, and a bomb bay capable of holding twice the amount of bombs. While the design is approved by 1939, it isn't until late 1941 that the Yubot 222 engines are available for testing, and they prove to still need quite a bit of work before being ready for production. Junkers has an idea to fix that problem, a stopgap design, improving the Ju-88 and turning it into the Ju-188.
And it was a very reliable, very nice plane. I liked the 88 and then the improved model of the 188, which I flew quite a bit too.
Well, the 188 had rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly, as one would expect with another move up the list. It had advanced a little over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better.
Based on the Ju-88B, this aircraft will have a newly designed fuselage and nose and longer wings that come to a point. It is to be powered by the BMW 801 engine. All the extra power from that engine can carry a more significant bomb load, though that causes a problem. The bomb bay on the 88 is already too small to accommodate much more. External bomb racks can be added under the wings, but this will affect performance. Why hold the bombs externally? It is purely a matter of speed and simplicity. It is thought that in a quick strike, waiting for the bomb bay doors to open will waste precious time. Without a bomb bay, destroying the enemy will be as quick as releasing the weapons above the target. Also, Germany has yet to develop as sophisticated a bomb sight as the Americans had, with the Norden bomb sight. By flying in low and dropping the bombs based on sight, the Luftwaffe can be sure they're hitting the correct targets. Accuracy is important because the Luftwaffe's bombers are lacking in one very important department, their bomb load. The Allied heavy bombers can carry massive amounts of bombs. The B-17 holds up to 17,000 pounds of bombs. The Ju-88 carries less than half of that.
Well, I think we missed the high-powered engines. It was the material which the American and English airplanes, the engine of the airplanes, were much stronger, much higher horsepower, because they have the right proper alloys in order to build it. And so the power was missing in the German airplanes, in the Dornier and in the Heinkel. We never could carry more than maybe 2,500 pounds bombs, and whereas all the different bombers of the Ally could carry much more bombers.
The development of further Schnell bombers, and perhaps the very fate of the war, is changed by a decision right from the very top. In 1943, Adolf Hitler is planning ahead, thinking to the inevitable day when Allied forces will storm the beaches of France for an all-out assault on his European empire. One day, in the not-too-distant future, enemy soldiers, weaponry and tanks will be crawling from the surf onto the sandy shores, and he will need to be prepared for them. At this very time, Professor Willy Messerschmitt's team is creating what will become the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262. What had started as a bluff by Messerschmitt to prove to an Air Ministry official that he, like rival Ernst Heinkel, is interested in the emerging power of the jet engine, is now well on its way to becoming a reality. Messerschmitt's team is working on something very special. The engine power of this fighter is absolutely unrivaled by anything the Allies have, and it is hoped by many in the Luftwaffe that it will be the key to defending the fatherland from destruction. While test flights of prototypes started as early as 1941, the aircraft first flies with a traditional piston engine. It is only in 1942 that it truly becomes a jet aircraft, with the BMW 003 engine installed under each wing. But they continue to prove unreliable as tests push forward. The Junkers Ulmo 004 engine seems a likely candidate to power the world's first operational jet fighter. While enough tests have been undertaken by 1942 to determine the airframe is ready for production, progress is slow on creating enough jet engines to power the aircraft.
I rate the 262 as the most formidable aircraft of World War II. I wouldn't have welcomed flying against it with what we had as the opposition aircraft at the time, because, as I say, there was a big gap. Performance gap, huge performance gap of at least 100 miles an hour. This is a huge gap. When you have a gap like this, the Me-262 could dictate the conditions of combat, when to start the combat, when to finish the combat. It could just, it was in control.
By 1943, an even bigger problem comes up. Hitler has taken notice of this remarkable design, and although it is meant to be a fighter aircraft, he has a different idea about its potential in serving the Third Reich. He asks Willy Messerschmitt if the aircraft can be adapted or changed into a fighter bomber. Surely a plane this fast carrying bombs, even as small as 150 kilograms, can cause enormous amounts of chaos and destruction in those critical first hours as the Allies arrive on European soil.
Hitler's idea to convert the 262 to a Schnell bomber wasn't a bad idea, but technically it was a bad idea. But because Willy Messerschmitt actually said that it could be done, quite flippantly, the downside of Hitler insisting on the Schnell bomber was that the production of the Me-262 was stopped as a fighter, and he ordered that all 262s be converted to bombers. Now, the delay in that meant that the fighter units were then starved of this jet fighter. And Adolf Galland was absolutely incensed at this, and so were a lot of other high-ranking Luftwaffe pilots. But Hitler insisted that this aeroplane be converted to a bomber. And this had to a large extent, had a fairly large effect on the future of the fighter force.
It is a decision that not only delays the deployment of the Me-262, but drives a wedge between Hitler's command structure and some of the Luftwaffe's most important leaders. Captain Erich Braun of the Royal Navy interrogated Hermann Göring after the war.
The only one question he bridled a bit at was I asked him why he had fallen out with Galland at the end of the war. But he was obviously a bit fed up with General Galland, and who opposed his and indeed the Führer's use of the Me-262 as a bomber rather than a fighter. There's been a lot of talk about this because Galland, who was the General der Flieger, was very, very critical of the fact that Hitler used the 262 as a bomber over the beaches at Normandy. And it's interesting to hear Goering's view on this, because he was incredibly loyal to Hitler, and his view was it was a matter of priorities. And what was the major priority between the following? Either stemming the flood of the invasion at Normandy, or stemming the absolutely endless bombing of the Third Reich. And Galland believed in the latter, and Hitler believed in the former. And who's to say who was right? I think there's a case on both sides, frankly. But having said that, it's difficult to split a machine into two, so to speak. I think it would have been better to, with hindsight, I'd say it would have been better to have gone Galland's way.
The plans to adapt the Messerschmitt 262 to its new fighter-bomber role doesn't stop at simply adding bomb racks to its wings. Willy Messerschmitt has an array of tweaks and adjustments that he hopes to add to the design in order to give the Führer the best Schnellbomber available. The Me-262U2 is a development that swaps the nose of the aircraft for a glass one. This will allow a second crew member, a bombardier, to lie in a prone position within the nose and drop bombs on targets with much greater accuracy. As well, structures known as Viking ship mounts, due to their curvature, are placed on the underside of the 262s to hold bombs below the aircraft.
As a bomber, not outstanding, because it didn't have a good bomb aiming system. No, not outstanding. It would have been a big nuisance and could have created a lot of havoc, but I don't think it would have turned the tide.
The Luftwaffe's desperate struggle to maintain their dominance above the battlefield led them to create many wondrous fast bombers. The necessity of their situation had forced them to evolve the very basic foundations of the aircraft, giving birth to the jet engine. Though previous engines had left them underpowered in comparison to the bombers of their enemies, perhaps this technological leap forward can turn the tide back in their favor. With their enemies pushing in on all sides and resources becoming more and more scarce, the Luftwaffe turns to innovation to keep them in the game in the battle for Europe. Next time on the Fast Bomber. With Hitler supporting the development of the Messerschmitt 262 to bomb the Allied landing craft during the inevitable invasion, other manufacturers continue to put forth designs to take its place should it fail. From another jet-powered aircraft to some very unusual and unique designs, the Luftwaffe continue to look for the ultimate Schnellbomber. It's been a long search for the perfect fast bomber. Since the Nazis took power, the Luftwaffe have been looking for a quick and deadly strike aircraft. From the early discovery of a fast mail plane that could be converted to hold bombs, to a promising bomber crippled by a general wanting more and more dive bombers, their search has not been easy. But with Willy Messerschmitt's first jet aircraft, Hitler may have found the fast bomber he needs to strike against his enemies.
Excellent, but Germany required it in huge numbers more than it had if it was really going to make an impact on the course of the war. And this was virtually impossible. It wasn't just a question of producing more fighters. The major problems were produce more pilots, produce more fuel.
Still other contenders are being designed. While Messerschmitt has his people working tirelessly to accommodate the Führer's demand for an Me-262 Schnellbomber, there is another aircraft that might do the job just as well. The Arado 234, a plane designed in 1941. As a single-seat reconnaissance plane, it is to be powered by two Junkers Yubot 004 engines. But production of the engines is often delayed, and it isn't until 1943 that the aircraft has its first flight. While it has a conventional appearance, it also has one major impediment.
Yes, the Arado 234B, which was an unarmed reconnaissance bomber, in its original form was taken off on a trolley in the same style as the later Messerschmitt 163. And when it lifted off, it retracted the skids. And of course, this meant you had extremely good streamlining and you got rid of quite a lot of weight by having a skid instead of an undercarriage. But when you landed, of course you were landing on a skid and you had to be removed from the runway or the airfield by tractor and then pulled back in, reloaded and put back up in the trolley. And the whole process, frankly, was far too cumbersome for operational needs. So after a very short time, this trolley was replaced by a normal undercarriage.
There was no problem really with the Arado 234. It was very straightforward. It was conventional, no tricks, no problems stability-wise, and it had enough fuel to operate in the theater, the European theater of operations, and no restriction on it. The engine start was a tough process. Starting both of those Yubot 004 engines was always the most difficult aspect of the flight. Whatever pilot got in it, that was the most difficult aspect of the entire flight, getting them started. And you just had to grind them and grind them and grind them, and finally they took hold. But the engine was a very respectable engine.
The Arado 234 was a beautiful looking airplane. Aesthetically, it was very clean and looked dynamic, aerodynamically, very attractive. And the cockpit was unusual. It was a glass cockpit right at the nose, and it reminded me, when I got into it, rather of like being in a helicopter. You were stuck right out in the front there with completely clear vision around you. On the other hand, you were sitting pretty close to the accident if it had to happen too. My first meeting with the 234 wasn't a very happy event because this was up at Grove in Denmark, where we found a number of 234s, and I had one prepared for a flight by the German crew because we obviously didn't have the expertise to deal with it at that stage. I taxied it out to the end of the runway. I was well aware, of course, that the Yubot 004 jet engines on the Arado 234 had a total scrap life of 25 hours. So it was really necessary to see the service record of these engines before you flew them. Well, the Germans were very adept at destroying documentation, so we had no record. However, I taxied out to the end of the runway at Grove and revved up to full power, ready for takeoff, and then just about to release the brakes when the starboard engine exploded and totally disintegrated, taking most of the starboard wing with it. And this, of course, could mean one of two things. Either the crew had sabotaged it, or it was an engine with 24 hours and 50 minutes on it. We never got to the bottom of what caused it, but suffice it to say that I must have flown something like 300 to 400 hours on the Jumo 004 in various aircraft, and never had another problem with it after that. So it did not give me a poor impression of the 234. On the contrary, when I flew it, it was a very nice aircraft to handle, had a very fast turn of speed. It could fly at and cruise. Its top speed was 474 miles an hour, which was very high. And of course, it relied on this speed for its survival, because it had no guns fitted to it, and was purely a reconnaissance bomber as such. But as I say, handled beautifully. It was straight wing, was not swept wing, and made a very good impression.
While the Luftwaffe does have designs for these jet-powered planes, manufacturing enough of them to make a difference is proving to be a challenge. Between a lack of raw materials and the constant Allied bombing, it is proving difficult to supply their pilots with these bold new machines.
Only unit to actually become operational with the Schnellbomber Me-262 was KG-51, which was an old bomber unit which converted complete to the Me-262 bomb carrier. Now, they were actually, 262s actually used under bridges at Remagen.
The perfect opportunity to employ a Schnellbomber comes late in 1944, as the Allies have breached the beaches of Fortress Europe and pushed in toward Germany. Ludendorff Bridge, a massive structure that crosses from Remagen to Erpel over the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. Hitler's scorched earth campaign called for the destruction of such timeless architecture in defense of the Reich. But the solid stone structure of the bridge may be more than he bargained for. After the 9th Infantry captures and holds the bridge from ground attacks, it is the jet-powered Me-262 Schnellbomber that is called in to finish the job. But the bridge takes the beating and continues to stand. Squadrons of Arado 234s also attempt to knock down the structure, but they too have little visible effect. It is finally the shock waves from a supersonic V-2 missile that does the job, missing the bridge, but disrupting it enough to let the toll of all those bombing runs topple the resilient crossing. Though these jet-powered bombers have proven to be quite effective as the war continues, the Luftwaffe simply cannot find enough resources to make them the front line of air attack for the Third Reich. With the Allies pushing further and further towards Berlin, these planes are the exception rather than the rule. Perhaps the answer to finding the perfect Schnellbomber is not to innovate the engines, but to innovate the entire design and structure of the plane. Just such a design may be on the way from a very unique mind, Dr. Richard Vogt of Blom and Voss. While still a student, Vogt met famed aircraft designer Ernst Heinkel and became inspired to take up a career in the aviation industry. Then, while working at the Zeppelin works during the First World War, he met another great aviation mind, Claudius Dornier. After enrolling at a technical university and receiving his doctorate, Vogt is sent by Dornier to Italy and then Japan, where he spends a decade designing aircraft in partnership with a Kawasaki dockyard company. Returning to Germany in 1933, as Hitler rises to power, Vogt finds himself working for the shipbuilder Blom und Voss, and it is here that he begins work on conventional aircraft before getting underway on his most famous creation, an aeroplane that some think may be a little off-kilter, the BV-141. Answering a call for a tactical reconnaissance plane, Vogt designs a distinctly different aircraft, one with a single engine and a gondola-like crew cabin on the starboard side to hold a pilot, observer and gunner. On the port, the BMW 801 radial engine trails out into a tail. While it may look unstable, and initial expectations are that it will be difficult to control, Vogt has factored into his design the weight differences between the two halves. This weight difference actually works to counterbalance the torque of the single engine, and the aircraft is found to handle quite well.
The BV Bloemen Vos 141 was in fact a very peculiar looking airplane. The idea was that if you were attacked, this airplane, where the pilot would roll it onto its left side, and it was claimed that it could fly along in this position perfectly straight, and therefore the tail gunner in the small cabin had a completely free field of fire because he had no tailplane to shoot off of his own tailplane, and this was the theory. I think it was a bit far-fetched. I flew the aircraft once, and although I would say up to quite a marked degree you could keep it flying straight on one side, vertically, I think it was a bit of a nonsense, frankly. And it gives you a very funny feeling as a pilot. I always felt when I was flying this thing I'd forgotten something because there were bits and pieces missing everywhere.
Now with the call out for bombers for the Third Reich, Vogt begins two concepts unlike anything seen before. First, Bloemen Vos Project 163, an attack bomber powered by two radial engines working in tandem with contra-rotating propellers. Like the BV-141, it doesn't have its crew in the center of the plane. Rather, the pilot, navigator and a gunner are located in a nacelle on the port wing. On the starboard side, two gunners sit in a similar pod. This keeps the rest of Project 163's fuselage open for fuel and its bomb bay, which can hold up to 4,400 pounds of bombs. The pilot and gunners benefit from having a wider field of view than they would have in a traditional cockpit, and it is calculated that the wingtip nacelles will not affect the aircraft's lift in a negative way. Project 163 is expected to fly up to 338 miles an hour. Could a squadron of these attack bombers be just what the Third Reich needs to strike at the encroaching Allies and secure the fatherland? With its speed and striking power, it seems as if it could be the ideal Schnellbomber, and its unusual layout will undoubtedly have a psychological impact on enemy forces if they're ever to catch a glimpse of this speedy wonder. But after placing a pod on the wing of a BV-141 to test the effectiveness of this unusual layout, it is concluded that the design isn't worth pursuing further. But that's not where Vogt's plans end. There is also Bloemen Vos Project 170. This is another peculiar-looking aircraft compared to its contemporaries. Two of its BMW 801 engines are to be placed at the tips of the wings on gondolas, with a third sitting at the very front of the fuselage. Each engine has its own fin and rudder. Like the BV-141, Vogt has factored in the engine's torque, and so the outer engines each rotate in opposite directions, cancelling out each other's torque. The tremendous potential of the BV-170 comes from its speed, and that's provided by conventional engines, and not the jet engines that are in such short supply and require constant maintenance. With these fast bombers filling the sky, the Luftwaffe would have a fighting chance to ward off their enemies and perhaps even strike back beyond their borders to retake the ground they lost as the war has progressed. With an expected flight ceiling of over 38,000 feet, not only would the BV-170 be a speedy bomber, but its altitude may allow it to fly above many of the Allied fighters, giving an extra advantage of height to the Luftwaffe pilots. Two cockpit designs are drawn up, but both have one commonality that sets them apart from other aircraft. The cockpit is at the extreme end of the fuselage, just ahead of the tailplane. The first design is set to have the bomber or radio operator sitting ahead of the pilot within the cylindrical section of the fuselage. The second reverses these positions and lengthens the visible portion of the cockpit. Project 170 is expected to hold up to 2,000 kilograms of bombs on mounts under its wings, and with its 3 powerful radial engines giving it a potential speed of up to 510 miles an hour, this bold design may be the perfect Schnellbomber. However, the Luftwaffe once again passes on producing the design, leaving it to fade away into history. Vought's unconventional designs are ahead of their time, and their asymmetric and unusual beauty make them seem as if they've come from a science fiction story rather than a wartime design for attack bombers. But the science and aeronautical engineering behind the designs is sound. And it is this sort of thinking that has Vought remembered long after his last plane took flight. But ultimately, it did little to help the Luftwaffe's efforts to win the war. But after a decade of designing and tweaking numerous aircraft in the hope of finding the ideal fast bomber, the war is coming to a close. Allied bombers are pounding the cities of the Third Reich, and ground forces are closing in around Berlin. By 1945, there is little chance that any of these aircraft, as advanced and amazing as they are, can hold back the stunning advance of the Allies on all fronts. Was the Schnellbomber a success as a concept?
Whether a Schnellbomber was a success or not is a difficult thing to actually say. I think it was the whole concept of the Schnellbomber was forced upon the situation of the war. From 44, middle 44 to the end of the war, the Germans were always on the defensive, and therefore their Luftwaffe was only able to actually attack certain parts, important parts of Allied pincer points or places where they were attacking, and it was only used as a defense. They had to use aeroplane as Schnellbombers. It was the only way they could actually defend themselves.
The Luftwaffe never found the perfect fast bomber they needed to win the war, as hard as they tried, and, in an ironic twist, the perfect fast bomber did appear in the skies while they were trying to manufacture one.
Yeah, the British Mosquito is another one of these aeroplanes that was almost an accident, because it was actually built during designed and built during a time when the RAF was in serious problem with raw materials. And of course, everybody knows that the Mosquito was basically made of wood. But when it was actually designed and built, it was such a fantastic aeroplane. It could fly, it was reconnaissance, it could be a bomber, it was high speed. The Germans hated it because they couldn't bring it down very easily. So yes, I mean, the Mosquito could have been a Schnellbomber.
The Mosquito's success and the innovative use of fast bombers by the Luftwaffe would have a significant influence in the years to come on aircraft development. In the post-war years, the need for such an aircraft led the United States to do something almost unprecedented, purchasing aircraft made outside their borders in the form of the Canberra. The concept of the fast bomber is one that held fast over the decades, because the theory is sound. To be able to swoop in, destroy a target with bombs or missiles, and then to speed away before the enemy could retaliate. Today's multi-role fighters can be traced back to this notion. They hold their armaments externally and use tremendous speed. That's because the idea of the Schnellbomber was to create a perfect marriage between the speed and maneuverability of a fighter aircraft and the destructive power of a bomber. 3/4 of a century after the first Schnellbomber was conceived, these multi-role fighters make up the backbone of air forces around the world.
Well, the Messerschmitt 262, in my opinion, was the most formidable fighter of World War II. They had the advantage of, when they designed this, of supersonic wind tunnels. That is clearly shown in the fuselage shape of the 262. They were also well aware of the advantages of sweepback in easing your way through the transonic speed area. The aircraft was designed with these things in mind. So it was going to be a jump ahead of its time, so to speak. When I first saw it, I realized that this was a very different looking airplane. But also, at that time, I hadn't fully realized just the impact its engines were going to have, because we, in the early jet stages in Britain, were using engines operating on the centrifugal principle of jet propulsion. The Germans started off in that area as well, but they had a sector that went onto axial flow. And of course, today every jet engine is axial flow. They were on the right track right away. But having said that they're on the right track, I must divert for a minute, because was it the right track at that time? I worked closely with Frank Whittle, who was invented or developed the jet engine. And I knew he knew all about the axial flow engine. I said to him, Frank, why have we gone centrifugal when the Germans are going axial? And he said, because in the early stages of jet propulsion, I want to give our Air Force an engine that is simple and reliable. Now, how right he was, because in the early stages, the German jet engines, whereas Frank Whittle's centrifugal engine had an overhaul life of 100 hours, you overhauled it, the German axial flow jet engines had a scrap life of 25 hours because they didn't have the strategic metals to withstand the heat stresses at that time. So, temporarily, we were on the right track. But eventually, of course, the axial flow offered advantages in streamlining, because for a given power, you had smaller compressor and turbine discs. And also, of course, it had better specific fuel consumption. And altogether, they were on the right track there. But unfortunately, they couldn't go to the ultimate because, as I said, they hadn't the right metals. However, as an airplane, this was something quite electrifying to fly. The cockpit, there was nothing particularly unusual. It wasn't a cluttered cockpit. It was quite simple, and it had the functional things here, and the engine instruments on the right, and generally good view, good canopy view, and being a tricycle, you had a good view ahead. So altogether, they had a lot going for it, apart from this unreliability of the engines. Even when they were in the air, they were very sensitive to throttle movement. Excessive movement, either accelerating or decelerating, could flame out the engines. And it got so bad, in fact, that eventually the way the Germans were operating was to take off at full power, then ease slowly back to climbing power, and never touch the engines thereafter until you were coming into land. They took that risk, and this didn't pay off, I don't think, because, as I say, although it has a scrap life of, theoretically, of 25 hours, but Adolf Galland told me at the end of the war that his unit, flying the 262 JG-44 at the end of the war, was only having an engine life average of 12.5 hours. So it goes to show what the vulnerability of that was. Firepower on this airplane, huge. 4 30mm cannon. They had forgotten one thing, and we did the same with our initial jet, experimental jet aircraft. They had forgotten how to slow it down. They did not have dive brakes. And this cost them a little because the aircraft was built mainly to deal with the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. And when you came in on a dive to attack them, your closing speed was huge. And you couldn't open fire because of the inaccuracy of the guns above 600 yards. So let's say you opened fire at 600, you had 2 seconds before you had to break away because your closing speed was so high. If they'd had dive brakes, that could have doubled the closing speed. Now with a closing speed of 2 seconds, you're firing at random. You're not sighting, you're just pressing the button and hoping you're pointing in the right direction. With 4 seconds, you can quickly sight and adjust and fire. So it made a big difference. Now the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II. When you consider that at the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When we tested the Messerschmitt 262, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. This was a quantum jump in performance, and it meant the 262 was virtually inviolate. It also handled quite well in the air. It had no nasty characteristics really, except if you lost an engine on takeoff before you reached safety speed. But apart from that, I was very impressed. It had 2 shortcomings, but all the early jets did in our country, in America and in Germany. Firstly, the engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, we hadn't thought, or the designers hadn't thought, of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the few 262s they picked off were usually in that phase of the operation. Of the 3 great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Ju-88, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Me-262 were the 3. The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. The Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190 PA4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Winkle 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up to the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication. And also, there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They had learned to put the 4 crew of the Ju-88 into one glasshouse, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188. The 188 had a rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better. And I was very impressed with both types of aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, as a fighter, was first class. There's no question of that. It was an outstanding airplane. And inevitably, as the war progressed, there were attempts made to keep up with the hunt, so to speak, and give it a variety of roles. And there were many different marks of 190, and it eventually gravitated into the fighter bomber. In that role, it was quite effective, actually. Fighter bombers have a limited role. They are used against what I call targets of opportunity. You don't use them to come in and bomb an industrial layout. What you do is you use them to shoot up trains or convoys you see on the road. And from this way, the Focke-Wulf 190 was very effective again. So it was a versatile aircraft. And as it progressed, it eventually had an engine change. The Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change and not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber.
In 1938, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring declares, "I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York with a 5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea." 4 years after that statement is made, the nation of Germany begins to feel the industrial strength of America firsthand. Bombers begin pounding the Nazi regime day after day with attacks from England. With the United States' means of production out of reach, any hope of retaliation seems impossible. Little do American leaders know that 3 planes are being developed in order to do just that. Messerschmitt 264, Junkers 390, and Focke-Wulf TA-400 are being rushed into production to make it across the Atlantic in order to reciprocate this destruction. It is a project cloaked in secrecy for more than 70 years. Many details are sketchy, based on hearsay and unsubstantiated claims. Now take an in-depth look at both the planes and the possibilities they represented. Could they have tipped the scale in favor of the Axis so late in the war? Could they have actually made it across the ocean and back without refueling? Explore alongside historians and experts the story of the America bombers. On December the 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war against the United States of America. Ever since the Second World War has begun, the two nations have been battling it out unofficially in the Atlantic Ocean.
Hitler probably declares war on the United States because there's already an undeclared war going on against the United States of America. In the North Atlantic, with U.S. destroyers, U-boats. So he may think it's simply inevitable. But whether he thinks it's inevitable or not, it probably wasn't, and it's a terrible mistake on his part.
We came in the war because of the Japanese, because of Hitler's stupid agreement with the Japanese. And he lived up to his agreement, but it really did cost him the war. You know, if he'd never made the alliance with Japan, you know, we might be doing this interview in German.
Before Pearl Harbor, America supplies the Allies with war materials, causing its ships and German U-boats to clash as a result.
It is quite clear that the United States had broken their neutrality at least 6 months before Pearl Harbor by assisting the British in getting the convoys from the United States to Britain safely and without being attacked by German submarines. So there was actually this warlike activity already in existence between American destroyers and German submarines without there being a public state of war.
Just prior to Pearl Harbor, there are a series of incidents in the North Atlantic. 3 destroyers are involved in altercations with German U-boats. The Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And there's an escalation with each one. And with the Kearney, it's merely an exchange of fire. There's a torpedo fired at the Greer after a U.S. plane takes a shot at the submarine. With the Kearney, the ship is actually hit with a loss of U.S. life. And with the Reuben James, that is sunk. And Roosevelt points to this as a reason for increased vigilance and activity against the Nazis. And it's a question of who fires first and all that.
For Hitler, the decision is an easy one. The United States will no longer be considered neutral. The gloves can finally come off. Its shipping capabilities are now fair game for German submarines. Once victory is declared over the Soviet Union, America and Britain will sue for peace. That is the Nazi plan. In less than a year, however, the exact opposite happens. Fighting against both Japan and Germany, the arsenal of democracy only grows stronger.
The Americans, again, had the resources, they had the industry, they had the time, and this huge industry that could produce trainers, fighters, light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, patrol bombers, any type of aircraft you can think of, and the tanks, and the trucks, and produce the gasoline, and the munitions, and everything else, and the ships, huge navy. They could do all of that at the same time. The Germans couldn't.
Factories begin turning out a plane every 5 minutes, and a ship every day.
American factories were in 24/7 production by the end of 1942, and in 43 and 44, not only armed one of the largest militaries in the world, but armed our allies as well, the British, the Soviet Union. In the course of the war, we gave somewhere around 50,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, 15,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft.
The United States has a unique advantage due to its geography. It does not have to worry about planes bombing their factories. It can go on producing at an unprecedented level.
America never really gets out of the Great Depression until World War II comes along. The unemployment figures were as high as 14–17% in the late 1930s, and they really don't start to drop until America becomes the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Allies and shipping literally billions of dollars overseas. The Lend-Lease program ultimately is $50 billion by itself, which in the dollars of today is about $800 billion, a tremendous stimulus package for the American economy.
They were delivering huge numbers of aircraft and tanks, and vehicles, trucks, etc. to the British and the Canadians and the Australians, etc. So they were a major producer of weapons for the Allies.
And having two oceans protecting its civilian population The American people are confident that they're providing materials that will shift the balance of power away from the Axis.
Economists say the natural resources of the United Nations are greater, but the capacity of the Axis to turn what resources they have into weapons of war is tremendous. They have the mighty Krupp munitions works. We have Birmingham. They have Skoda. We have Delaware. They have factories like this in occupied France. England has Vickers. They seized the steel mills of Luxembourg. We have Pittsburgh. They have great factories to turn out Heinkels, Messerschmitts, Dorniers. We turn out flying fortresses, P-38s, P-40s, Aerocobras, Tomahawks, many others. Romanian oil drives their planes and tanks. Oil from the fields of Oklahoma, Texas, and California will drive our planes and tanks.
For German leaders, the United States poses a serious dilemma. With more than 5,000 miles separating the two countries, no existing German aircraft can even come close to reaching America's east coast. In early 1942, the only strategy available to Nazi war planners is unrestricted submarine warfare.
One of the most successful weapons that the Nazis had was the U-boat fleet, the U-boat service, the Kriegsmarine, which is essentially, by the end of the war, a U-boat navy. They were in 1942. They were wildly successful. It looked like they were going to just win the war just by sinking everything in the Atlantic.
A plan known as Operation Drumbeat begins with U-boats torpedoing America's shores, sinking millions of tons of shipping.
Well, the Americans, of course, were very much surprised by the immediate reaction of, or action, not reaction, by German submarines after the war has been declared by Germany. Germany at that particular time sent a group of submarines over to the American coast, and America was totally unprepared for that kind of assault. And the German submarines over there found absolutely no opposition whatsoever, and it was partly a Turkish shoot for them. The ships were illuminated; they were not in convoys. The cities were not blacked out, so it was partly for them almost a peacetime-like exercise they did, and of course they were very, very successful in doing so, and put America into a state of shock from which it took them many, many months to recover.
Operation Drumbeat, or Paukenschlag in the original German, was the first U-boat offensive against the east coast of the United States. And to say that it was a happy time for the U-boats and their crews is understating the case considerably. And in fact, many of them did look back on it as those who survived the war look back on 1942 as just kind of a happy hunting time. It takes all modern nations some time to gear up into a war posture, and it might take democracies longer than dictatorships, and it might take our fractious and argumentative democracy in America even longer than some. And certainly the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and we were at war a couple of days later, but it's not to say we took it with the seriousness that it deserves. And something as simple as blacking out cities on the East Coast was policies and procedures would have to be drawn up. It's not simply a case of everyone in New York turning out their lights at the same time. Now, with illuminated cities along the East Coast, every single American transport which sailed from harbor was nicely silhouetted against a bright background of lights. And U-boat and submarine commanders just could not have had a juicier or more lucrative target. And these experienced crews took advantage of it, sinking somewhere around 2 million tons of shipping in 1942.
Caught off guard, it takes time for American war planners to augment their strategy in dealing with this submarine menace. Through the use of a convoy system, as well as ordering mandatory blackouts, Operation Drumbeat fades away.
The turning point can be placed at early 1943, and in May, I think, when we lost about 40 boats in 1 month or something like that.
By 1943, materials and supplies begin reaching Britain with little interruption. Once on English soil, their impact is felt immediately. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators begin flying over the heart of Germany. Alongside British planes, the fatherland is bombed mercilessly.
The offensive continues in greater and greater strength.
Well, certainly German industries took a pounding. German civilians took a pounding. Winston Churchill probably put it best when he once said that the air effort was dehousing the German people, destroying their living quarters one building at a time.
Cities are turned into rubble. And with Soviet victories on the Eastern Front, the Allied powers begin closing in on the Axis. Hitler, seeing the destruction firsthand, is outraged at these bombings. However, with his U-boats neutralized and the United States out of reach, there's little Nazi generals can do to fight back against the American war machine. What is needed is a wonder weapon to enact revenge. Beginning as early as the interwar period, German war planners study a hypothetical attack on the United States.
Dornberger, assisted by Werner von Braun, had been thinking about some kind of a rocket-propelled weapon that could attack the United States as far back as 1937. There was a weapon that they were designing called variously either the New York bomb or the American rocket. It had an interesting intent. They would take a massive, massive booster rocket, put a V2 at the top of it, fire it off, and the V2 would eventually attain speeds of 6,000 miles an hour, which meant that it could cross the Atlantic in something like 40 minutes. It could strike New York, it could strike Washington, it could strike Boston.
Of course, you can never laugh these things off because Germans were so innovative that sometimes they achieved things which to many minds were quite impossible.
The Germans were never able to launch any sort of attack on the continental United States. That's not to say they didn't talk about it, they didn't plan on doing it, and they didn't draw up various schemes for doing it, some relatively realistic and some much more fanciful.
Many concepts are examined and many are rejected due to their technological limitations.
There was the notion, for example, of launching a V-1, the so-called buzz bomb, in some ways the distant ancestor of our modern cruise missile, of launching a V-1 from a ramp on the deck of a U-boat that had surfaced off of the American coast. Now, of course, the problem of getting a German U-boat to the American coast with a large ramp and a buzz bomb on top of it was never really dealt with.
Some of these ideas even border on the realm of a science fiction novel.
Likewise, there was a plan for towing a V-2. Now, the V-2 being the not-so-distant ancestor of the post-World War II intercontinental ballistic missile, of taking a V-2, encasing it in its own missile launcher, and then putting it into position on the back of a U-boat. The launcher would swing into a vertical position, that is a launch position, and thus then launch the weapon against an American city, presumably New York, and presumably Manhattan. Now, the problems with such a plan, of course, include getting, once again, that V-2 over the Atlantic Ocean, crawling with U.S. naval vessels of various shapes and sizes, not to mention our own submarine fleet, and doing so while trailing an extremely heavy and extremely obvious 118-foot-long canister without being detected.
The most realistic and achievable weapon is a long-range bomber.
In 1939, things in Europe were not going too well, and war clouds were beginning to erupt. It was then that Hitler realized, and some of the hierarchy in the Luftwaffe realized, that they may need something that could fly a little bit further than what they originally conceived. So they put out a specification to try and get a bomber that might reach the United States.
Attacking the American East Coast with raids the same way the B-17 is attacking the fatherland.
The Germans were very intent on finding some way that they could strike the United States by air. Besides having worked on rocketry, they were also developing a bomber.
So the Germans realized that at one point if you wanted to stop or at least put a brake on the production effort in the US, you would have to put some threat over their head. The only way to do that would be to bomb them.
Unfortunately for the Nazis, it's a goal that's difficult at best. For a plan like this to work, it must reach America and back without refueling.
The problem that the Germans faced in building a long-range bomber is long-range. It had to go across the Atlantic, bomb New York City, maybe a little slack time there in case they ran into some fighters or something, and then it had to turn around nonstop without landing and fly back to Norway or the west coast of France. Which this is a long trip, and nobody does this today. Your 747 doesn't do this today. They'll land in Europe or in England and refuel and check the plane out. They couldn't do this. The Germans couldn't do this. They had no way to land. So if you're going to do this in a round-trip fashion, you have to have a truly intercontinental bomber. And this is something the United States didn't have until the B-36, which was 1949, 1950.
Their best chance is with the Bollemann-Voss 222 flying boat. But the odds of it making it back to the fatherland are slim to none.
Well, I flew the 222, and I would certainly agree it could get to within range of the American coast. It was a pretty impressive flying boat. I do not believe that they could ever have attacked the American coast and got away with it, because though it had this tremendous range and it was nice, quite nice to fly, got quite light handling controls, it was very vulnerable to a fighter attack. And I just don't see it surviving any attack by any fighter at all, frankly.
12,000 miles would be needed in order to strike. No plane during this time can even come close in covering a distance this size. The Germans' longest-range bomber, the Heinkel 177, is encountering numerous problems with its unworkable tandem engine arrangement.
They didn't really get around to building four-engine bombers, and when they did, it was an off and on type of thing. So one general actually was fired over this idea that he didn't come up with a four-engine bomber later on in the war, Ernst Udet. He was marginalized and then committed suicide, probably over this very issue.
A plane of this magnitude must instead be designed from scratch.
But they realized it would have to be a very long-range bomber. For all intents and purposes, you're looking at the German equivalent of the B-29.
And in order for it to work, an enormous amount of time and material is needed for production, development and testing, something the Germans are lacking by this time.
There were lies about the stocks of aluminium available. Production had not been rationalized, civilian resources had not been mobilized, and there was still a belief on the part of fighter pilots that quality was what mattered and that you would only get that by producing aircraft in relatively small numbers. So mass production was avoided. In 1944, Britain alone had 12 factories that employed more than 10,000 people. Germany only had 2.
Despite these roadblocks, Adolf Hitler, having a fascination with wonder weapons, enthusiastically gives a green light to the project. The America bombers are born. To provide a buffer of relief, Nazi planners believe they have a perfect halfway point. The Azores, an archipelago of 9 islands located 900 miles east off neutral Portugal, is ideal for a project of this nature.
Now they realized that the distances were huge. Actually, that's why they considered using the Azores as a base. It's halfway across, not quite halfway across the Atlantic, but it's certainly closer than bombing from bases in France. So there was definitely an interest there.
In 1940, after the fall of France, Admiral Raeder strongly urged Hitler to occupy them before the Americans could get to the islands first.
At one time, it was speculated, even Hitler suggested, that perhaps they should invade the Azores and take over the Azores and use it as a jumping off point for their long-range aircraft to fly to the States.
Now, if German planes are given permission to land the same way German U-boats are allowed to dock, this geostrategic area would be worth its weight in gold. Having the range requirements significantly reduced, the plan to bomb America now appears more feasible than ever. What is needed now are targets. In order to cripple the arsenal of democracy, these hypothetical German planes cannot just bomb indiscriminately. They instead must go right after their means of production, attacking factories that are building the planes and bombs that are ruining German cities. Prepared by the War Department in April of 1942, a 33-page document lists 21 potential targets for the Germans to attack. The Aluminum Company of America, located in Messina, New York. The Chrysler Corporation in Detroit. The Wright Aeronautical Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and many others are the destinations for the America bombers. The targets and the takeoff are set. In looking for companies to build these super bombers, the Nazi regime goes to the very best.
They came up with some designs. Of course, every builder would come up with, every aircraft manufacturer would come up with a design, and they would take a look at the designs on paper and select one.
Messerschmitt, makers of the Me-109 and the 110, two planes that battled Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. It's also the company that's working on the revolutionary Me-262, the first jet-powered aircraft. Beginning in the late 1930s, Messerschmitt begins dabbling in what is known as Secret Project P-1061. Its requirements are for an aircraft capable of reaching bases in Central Africa as well as Vichy French territories. Now, the plan calls for a plane that can reach the United States, carrying a payload of 5,000 kilograms.
Messerschmitt came up with an idea that got off the ground, the Messerschmitt 264, and they originally wanted something like 6 prototypes for testing. And if these were proved successful, then they were going to build a fleet of them.
Awarded the contract by the German government, workers at Messerschmitt begin working on the aircraft known as the Me-264. Different versions are considered, and once the plane begins taking shape, it starts to look eerily similar to another design that's being constructed across the ocean.
So by and large, there were designs. I think there was a Messerschmitt 264, which looks a little bit like a B-29.
The 264 was actually quite an interesting aeroplane design. It had a circular fuselage section, which in stress terms was very, very good, because the circle has equal stress points. It was built over a long period of time, and it didn't actually fly until 1942.
Originally designed with 4 BMW 801G engines, German officials hope that a 6-engine version will be in the skies as early as the fall of 1943. However, designers are noticing that the first prototype of the aircraft has a very high wing load. This is resulting in a loss of maneuverability, an unimpressive climb rate, and in-flight instability. 2 more prototypes are to be tested, one with armaments and one that is to be fully completed. However, with the aircraft being years away from flying, alternative designs and designers are sought out. Junkers, makers of the Stuka dive bomber and the Ju-52 transport plane, present their vision of a transoceanic aircraft capable of bombing Uncle Sam. The company is highly favoured amongst top Luftwaffe officials when it's taken over by the government in 1935, following the death of its founder, Hugo Junkers. Having overseen the company's nationalization personally, Field Marshal Erhard Milch leans towards the alternative. One of their planes already on the books is the Ju-290, an evolution of an earlier design with a greater wingspan, used for long-range maritime reconnaissance and bringing supplies to German soldiers, most notably during their encirclement at Stalingrad.
The 290 had the advantage of having a roll-on, roll-off capacity for equipment. because it had a rear door that could be dropped. And that was the big advantage. You didn't need to have trucks to load it and unload it. You could actually drive on and drive off. And that was the major advantage of the 290.
The train of thought now is to just enlarge this aircraft for bombing America. The result is the Ju-390, a plane with 6 1700 horsepower engines, a wingspan of 181 feet, and a fuselage that is even longer than the American B-29.
Junkers were actually adapting their Ju-290 aircraft into the Ju-390, which was actually a 6-engined aircraft. And a lot of people, especially the German Navy, thought that would be quite a nice aeroplane, and others thought that yes, it would make a very nice America bomber.
The Ju-390 was a similar situation. There were 2 built that we know of. One was given to Hans Bauer, the Hitler's pilot. So it was for Hitler's use, for state use. So Hitler had a 390.
Built at the Junkers factory in Dessau, the first prototype is able to make its maiden flight in August of 1943.
They had high hopes for this bomber, and between this and the Messerschmitt 264, it looks like that much time, or if not in total time, these were controlled by the SS.
Despite its early success, the Nazi hierarchy still wants an insurance policy. On August the 11th, 1938, the nation of Germany makes history when a Focke-Wulf Condor arrives in New York City after a rigorous 24-hour flight across the Atlantic.
There was still this belief in the USA that they were very safe, and isolationism was still very, very rife there, and that any kind of invasion from abroad would have been almost impossible. However, in 1938 an event occurred which changed all that. This was that on the 10th of August 1938, a Focke-Wulf 200 took off from Berlin-Staaken and flew right across the Atlantic and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in New York after a 24-hour, 59-minute flight, non-stop. This put the wind up. Senior military people who suddenly realized that they weren't quite as safe as they thought.
Having proved itself capable of flying long distances, the aircraft goes to work during the war, providing reconnaissance for U-boat operations.
The Focke-Wulf 200, it was of course the civil Condor at one stage, and then it was militarized to become the Courier. And in fact, as the Courier, it was very successful as a reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic. It was very heavily armed, and it had a wide range, and where it did the damage was it could operate beyond fighter range from England or from Britain.
Now, the plan is to evolve the Condor the same way that the 290 is being evolved. The result is the TA-400, consisting of 6 BMW 1700 horsepower engines. Just to keep this monster up in the air, an unprecedented 32 fuel tanks, capable of carrying 7,000 gallons of gasoline, are put on board the aircraft. Possessing a pressurized cockpit, 2 remote-controlled turrets, 20mm cannons, and a payload of 22,000 pounds. The third of the America bombers appears to be the deadliest. As Germany struggles to find a way to attack the United States, many options are looked at. Submarines, space rockets, and espionage are appealing. But the most realistic strategy by 1942 is a long-range bomber. 3 companies, Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf, all bring their designs to the table and begin working on planes that can render a decisive blow against America.
Russia did not actually capitulate. And in the winter of 1941, it actually launched a counterattack in front of Moscow. And there began a phase of the war which was to last more or less till its end. It was a war of attrition, a war eventually to be on two fronts, precisely the war that Germans always knew they couldn't win.
By 1944, the tide has turned in favor of the Allies.
Beginning in 1943, the American Air Force and the RAF, the British Air Force, were mounting 1,000-plane raids against Germany. By 1944, these raids were creating havoc in Germany. 3 raids against the city of Hamburg resulted in something like 50,000 German dead. The cities in Germany were being destroyed, leveled at the rate of something like 2 a month.
While the principles of war remained unchanged, the use of new weapons revised the concept of war. This time, Germany was faced with a weapon that leaped over battle lines and frontiers and smashed at the ultimate enemy, the German worker, who equipped and fed the German soldier. This time, the enemy nation was physically destroyed before its defending army was defeated.
But as the Allies came to rely increasingly on a strategy of strategic air power as a way of bringing Germany low, the need became pressing for some sort of escort fighter, and of course that need was met in the P-51.
The P-38 was available at first, then the P-47. Neither had the range to be able to escort the bombers all the way from England to Germany and back. The P-51 was the first that could do that. So now you had bombers flying raids all the way into the heart of Germany, even as far as Berlin, being able to have a very effective fighter escort the whole way there and back.
In England, Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, is being planned by both British and American generals for later that year.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters overboard. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by them. So, I mean, you know, it had a huge effect, I think, on the whole course of the war, of being able to bring the fight directly to the German tactical aviation forces.
For a Germany in its last throes, they begin turning to the secret weapons they have invested so much time and money into as the saviors that can strike a knockout blow.
The Holy Grail was a weapon of mass destruction. And they had gone the road of the nuclear, hoping to get the nuclear bomb. They had gone the road of the V1 and the V2. But they were always, as I say, searching for that Holy Grail.
August of 1944, Hitler and Mussolini met in Germany. Mussolini took a train to Germany, and they had a little heart-to-heart talk. Mussolini said to Hitler, look, I've been deposed once, I've been reinstalled in northern Italy. The Allies are in Italy. The Allies are closing in, the Russians are closing in from the east. It's August of 1944, and what guarantee do I have if I still throw in my cards with you, Adolf Hitler, that you can actually pull this war out, because it's not looking good now. And Hitler said to Mussolini in so many words, I have some wonder weapons coming.
In Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe is working overtime, getting the V1 flying bomb ready to launch. And if this device fails, the revolutionary V2 rocket is going to strike the fear of God into the Allies, being the predecessor of today's intercontinental ballistic missile.
The V1 and the V2 were extremely important in terms of later weapons development. The V2, of course, a single glance at it will make clear that it is the ancestor of the later ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. But perhaps even more than that for most Americans, it is clearly the ancestor of our NASA effort to reach space.
The target for both these weapons is London, where no one will be spared. Britain's ally, the United States, is also set to receive a deadly dose of a different type of wonder weapon,
the Americans were using Great Britain as an aircraft carrier to bomb Germany. Bombing England or bombing London alone, the British may have said no more, but there's no guarantee that the Americans were even going to let them do that at this point. They were so intent upon crushing Germany, and they had the Russians moving in from the east. So for a lot of political reasons, you have to stop this at the source. So the Germans were interested in bombing New York City, number 1, Moscow, number 2, and London, number 3.
In order to strike fear across the Atlantic, the America bombers are being hurried along. As development continues, the Nazi leadership is hoping to get at least one of these planes across the ocean to deliver a fatal blow.
The Junker 390, which was tested in a flight that managed to remain aloft for something like 12,000 miles, which would easily have made a round trip to the United States. And one of the practice runs they ran within 12 miles of the U.S. coast. The Germans even had another bomber in their plans, and that was a Messerschmitt plane, the Me-264. It was also tested and very likely could have struck the United States.
If this plan proves successful, the psychological impact could be the German equivalent of the Doolittle raid.
Yeah, the targets for the Me-264 would obviously have been preferred to be military targets. But the propaganda value of simply dropping a few bombs on New York would have had an amazing effect both in the USA and on the morale in Germany. In the USA, it would have no doubt caused a lot of panic and created a lot of defensive maneuvers within the East Coast because they didn't know if and when the bombers could come back.
In bombing the United States, the Germans saw that they could politically damage the United States, damage the American leadership so much that the Americans would reconsider their quest for total victory. In other words, that the Germans could do a deal. The Germans could do an armistice on the Western Front and perhaps keep fighting the Soviets. They really didn't like the Soviets. The Americans and the British they didn't, that wasn't part of the bargain when they started the war. They really didn't, they looked upon us as more of a nuisance that got to festered and became a huge problem for them. So they would have always liked to just do away with us and continue fighting the Soviets.
As intelligence leaks, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill begin to worry about the secret weapons Germany might have in store for them.
Franklin Roosevelt was very conscious of the capacity of German science. And indeed, in 1944, in December of that year, one of his agents who was posted in Turkey, which was a hotbed of international espionage, reported to him that the Germans had mastered another weapon called the V3, and that it was capable of attacking the United States. Now, Roosevelt took this threat seriously. In fact, he confided to one of his people that he understood that a single bomb launched in this method could destroy a United States city. So he put the East Coast on alert when this attack presumably was going to happen. Obviously, it did not occur, but it pointed out the potential of German science.
If resources are diverted, England will be softened up for the eventual launchings of the V1 and the V2. The only thing that Germany does not have on its side is time. By 1944, as the America bombers are being developed, Germany remains in a weakened state. Being pounded into submission day and night by Allied planes taking off from the coast of England, and with the Soviet Union moving in from the east, it's no longer an if, but when the Nazis will surrender. Their factories cannot continue unless a dramatic reversal of fortune occurs. Only a miracle weapon can save them, which along with the V1 and the V2 is hopefully the planes designed to pulverize Uncle Sam. However, just as the project begins to develop, the dominoes begin to fall, lessening the chances that one of these planes will make it up into the skies before it's too late. The first of these is the decision by the Portuguese government to lease the Azores bases to the Allies. Sensing which direction the war is going in, the neutral nation turns away from the German plan to launch the America bombers from their territory. This key strategic site, where the Third Reich planned to base these planes, is now only a distant memory. As German cities and industries crumble, Luftwaffe officials are forced to make drastic cuts. In many respects, the America bombers are typical of the hundreds of secret projects being mismanaged that become the Achilles heel of the Luftwaffe.
Right up to the last day of the war, they were working on 138 different guided missile projects. How can a nation which is on its knees be expending effort like this? Fortunately for us, they were expending this sort of effort through total mismanagement and lack of control of their resources.
And one of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended. This took place throughout the war, compared to, for example, U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
Only 3 Me-264s had actually been ordered, out of which only 1 was realized, and the other 2 were still in small parts, and nothing really serious was taking place there. And then out the blue, the RLN, the German Air Ministry, asked if they could produce 30 Me-264s. But then everybody realized that where would they build them, how would they build them, and from what would they build them? It was really the boat had been missed on any of that.
The resources, the time, the crews, the ground support equipment, the bases, because you can't base aircraft of that size on a grass field. You need all the infrastructure. You have to get the bombs to the base. You have to get the fuel to the base, and not just once. You have to get the fuel coming back constantly, day after day after day. It's a huge infrastructure that the Americans and the British had to put up in Great Britain. The UK was a giant service station. It's hundreds, thousands of aircraft had to be refueled constantly. That infrastructure did not exist in occupied Europe for a large bomber force. Because sending 2 aircraft every week, what's the point?
With resources strained, planes still in their design stage are now in the crosshairs. One aircraft that's on the chopping block is Focke-Wulf's TA-400. After assessing its design and noticing it requires more labour and materials than the Me-264, the decision to cancel it is made in late 1943.
They investigated and then realised that to actually build it and make it fly would take so many years that it was just impractical to even consider the project as being feasible.
Even as the prototype of the Ju-390 proves to be feasible, by mid-1944, all orders of that plane and the 290 are cancelled.
Again, it would have taken a vast amount of space and material and everything to build. And it really, the performance of the 390 didn't come up to what was expected. So that idea didn't go any further, although the German Navy quite liked the aeroplane.
Now, the only hope is with Messerschmitt.
One was destroyed on the ground. The program was canceled, as all German programs were. There's a start-stop attitude. So it may have been started and stopped several times.
Because of the changing situation of the war, and people had lots of ideas for strategic bombing. One day they were for it, the next day they were against it, and specifications were sort of being issued left, right and centre. Messerschmitt actually did produce a large number of projected modifications to his 264, but none of them ever came to any fruition. I mean, there were ideas to attach huge fuel tanks to the airplanes, which could be 600-gallon fuel tanks carried externally. Also, a 6-engine version was proposed. But all this was real pie-in-the-sky stuff, and because none of it could really be achieved at that time of the war. Things were really starting to go bad for Germany, and a lot of this stuff was just panic measures, trying to sort of clutch things out of the air, which really were just not possible.
With the continued bombardment causing a severe strain on the country's resources, Erhard Milch decides to stall production of the 264 and instead focus on the 262. The priority now is defence, and the hope is that this jet fighter bomber can shoot down the flying fortresses that have been pounding them into submission. That same year, several Allied bombing raids on the Messerschmitt factories damage all of the 264s beyond repair. By October of that year, the aircraft is cancelled indefinitely. All of these factors combined spell doom for the America bombers.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In the more than 60 years since the Nazi regime was destroyed, many questions surrounding the America bombers program remain unsolved.
When we interrogated William Messerschmitt, he pooh-poohed it as if, I really had nothing to do with it. I think they realized they were going down a blind alley with that, really.
For a project cloaked in secrecy, rampant rumours begin spreading in the decades following VE Day. One such rumour is the assertion that the Ju-390 successfully made a reconnaissance flight of approximately 12,000 miles from occupied France to New York Harbor.
The fact that a Junkers Ju-390 came within 12 miles of New York is something that's said by many sources. It's not just one source. This isn't a wild and crazy guy saying this. This is something that is said and repeated, and I believe to be true.
A hypothetical question asked is, what impact would these planes have had if they were successful in carrying out bombing raids on American cities?
But I would say that even if the Germans could have put 2 or 3 aircraft together that could somehow make that perilous flight across the Atlantic and lob a couple of bombs into lower Manhattan, I think the political impact would have been tremendous. At the very least, President Roosevelt would have been forced to redeploy anti-aircraft assets from Britain, where they were protecting Britain against German air attack, to the continental United States. And that might have had some appreciable impact on the future course of operations in Western Europe.
If the United States had actually suffered on its shores serious damage from German rocketry or from other transoceanic bombers such as they intended, the probably impact on the war would be that it would have been extended. Given the great industrial, innovative powers of the United States as demonstrated in that war by our production, the development of an atom bomb, no doubt we would have struck back, but it certainly would have extended the war to have the destruction brought to our shores.
I wouldn't say a waste of resources, but to a large extent, the hopes of actually curtailing, even annoying the Americans was very small. They might have annoyed them all right, but that would not have been good because the Americans might simply have reacted by bombing the German factories and the bases more fiercely than they did. So in the end, chances are, even that the Germans built the bombers and the bases, they would not have remained in operation very long. They may not even have been completed before they got pulverized.
Would they have been able to crack the well-oiled American war machine by 1945? Would they have been able to weaken civilian morale?
When you look at the effect of the German bombing of England during the Blitz
it's pretty clear it strengthened British resolve. It caused more of a feeling of we've got to get back at those guys rather than fomenting this attitude of, oh, there's no point, we should surrender. So if you're talking about strategic bombing as trying to sap the morale of the enemy, the evidence is pretty clear that doesn't work.
Naturally, the American people probably felt very secure having an entire ocean between ourselves and the war that was raging in Europe. What effect, let's say, on morale would have occurred had the Germans been able to strike us directly? I think it would have been very likely the parallel with London and Berlin. These places were smashed. Berlin was practically reduced to rubble by 1,000-plane raids, but people kept their chins up. They managed to take it and went on from day to day. I don't believe that the American people would have reacted anyway differently.
It's very difficult for people who have not been involved in a war like that, or have not gone through the experience, to understand that war to us had become a condition which to us was no more different than the weather. It was something we had to live with. You could talk about it, you couldn't do a darn thing about it. And the fact that cities got destroyed or submarines got sunk or whatever, it was just part of war, and we took it very naturally somehow without being as dismayed as we are today when we read history.
The plan to bomb America proved appealing to many in the High Command, an act of revenge against a nation that seemed impregnable. Like many other secret Nazi projects, however, a firm lack of purpose and direction existed. The bureaucracy in place at the time and the continued destruction of German factories and cities guaranteed that aircraft like these, despite their potential, would never get off the ground. Instead, these planes and the men behind them remain a pipe dream, one of the Second World War's greatest what-ifs.
Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Some say the Nazis' legendary strategy was a myth, others that it was a brilliant new way to wage war. Whatever the truth, the concept of striking quickly and setting their enemies off balance was key to how the German military approached warfare in the early 20th century. In the early stages of their quest for territory, the dive bomber played a key role in this strategy. But as the engines that powered their enemies' fighters got faster, and as the British fought back with ferocious tenacity, the dive bomber was nearing obsolescence. Something new would have to be found, a better way for the Luftwaffe to strike into enemy territory. They would need a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber. The 1937 Zurich Air Meeting. Pilots and aircraft from all over Europe arrive in the Swiss capital for 10 days of races, aerobatics and demonstrations. The Italians and the French both bring pilots and aircraft. The British send a small aerial team, and Germany has entries in many events. In an alpine circuit race that runs from Dubendorf to Thun to Bellinzona and back to Dubendorf, a Messerschmitt 109 wins the first round of the race. In the second section, A Dornier Do-17, a new German bomber, leads the way, completing the circuit in 58 minutes and 42 seconds at a speed of 233.5 miles per hour to win the race. Though the